So yeah, as you said, I'm Marian Murray at Utah State University, and I will be covering landscape pests and some fruit pests. And then Nick Valesky will take over halfway through and cover vegetable pests and some resources that you can use for pest management. So we'll just jump right in. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some landscape and garden pests. And David, if a question comes in that's pertinent to exactly what I'm talking about, you can feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, yes, we'll wait till the end.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay, great. All right, so some fruit pests. And, this actually, I wanted to say this topic is a big one. So Nick and I are really just we've kind of chosen some certain pests that might be active now or that are more major pests to talk about. So there's no way to cover everything. But for fruit pests, I thought I would cover some from the different tree fruit crops. So apple, pear, about 3 different pests, 1 from peach and 1 from cherry. So on apple and pear, I hope you guys are all familiar with the pest codling moth. It is the primary pest of these 2 crops. And the problem with the codling moth is that it's active all season long. Pretty much within 21 days after full bloom through harvest, depending on when you're harvesting, the fruit can become infested with codling moth. And it's, of course, the worm in the apple, we call that a larva, that tunnels into the fruit and feeds on the seeds. And when fruit's infested, you can tell because they push out their excrement from where their feeding tunnel. And you can see that on the outside of the fruit. So the management for codling moth, there are a few non-chemical options that can help prevent that infestation. So on this picture, I showed this area that's become infested. The larva has entered the fruit where the fruits are touching. And so if you can thin the fruit to a single apple or pear per cluster, and then space those single fruits out, then you can reduce the chances of that entry where the fruits are touching. So good thinning. Fruit's going to be dropping all season long, and if it's infested, then that's going to just contribute to the population. So mow those over or remove them throughout the season. And if you do have apple trees, pears, or crab apples that form fruit that are unmanaged, and you don't care about the fruit, maybe consider taking that tree out and putting in something else, because that's just contributing to the population for other people or even commercial producers that really have to, make a living with their crop. But chemical options, if you take that route, should begin about 3 weeks after full bloom. And there's a whole host of products that can be used. And at the end, as I said, Nick's going to talk about some resources. We have an advisory that covers a lot of this information. But conventional products, there's a couple for the residential backyard application. And they're both considered what we call pyrethroids. So they're broad spectrum, but they're pretty effective and give you about 14 days of control. And there are some organic options that will give about 7 to 10 days of control. And this first one is called Safer Bio Neem. And it's not neem oil. It's actually a derivative of neem oil called azadirachtin. So it's what's called an insect growth regulator. So it's pretty effective, but it's not one that I see in our local garden centers. So you might need to get it someplace online, like Planet Natural. Spinosad is another good organic option, and there's several different brands that make products that contain spinosad. And then this final one, Safer, you might recognize that as an insecticidal soap. So it's a soap mixed with pyrethrin, which is the organic form of pyrethroid, and neem oil. So it's that triple blend. All right, so another apple pest, woolly apple aphid. And I'm bringing this up because we have seen a lot more of this particular aphid in backyard settings. So it's an aphid that can be pretty devastating to the growth of the tree because it reduces tree vigor. And if young trees are affected, it may cause the death of those trees. So the aphids are covered in this cottony, waxy coating, which really protects them from predators and even from any insecticides that we might spray on them. And they love to feed in these tight cracks and crevices in the bark. So they're not necessarily feeding on the foliage, they're feeding from the bark area. But they also can feed on the roots. And that's that kind of double whammy of feeding on the tree that can cause that decline in the tree. So these guys, if they're overwintering in the tree, they start to reproduce and their colonies grow by mid-spring or so. So if you're out there, if you have apple trees, and you might want to start looking for these in old pruning cuts or branch crotches. Because if you don't, and if you have this pest, by the end of the season, part of your tree will look like this, where the leaves are turning yellow. The aphid colonies have gotten so big that they're just dripping honeydew. So it can be quite a mess. And as I said, they also are feeding on the roots. So they're causing galls, which somewhat restricts the flow of water and nutrients. So managing the woolly apple aphid, as I mentioned, it has this cottony covering that's pretty impervious to water. And so it's more difficult to manage. And so I've listed here some insecticide options, but they work best when you can catch those aphid colonies that are just starting. Once they get to be those larger colonies, they're very difficult to manage. And so we get a lot of calls about woolly apple aphid in August and September, after it's almost too late to do anything about them. So the last apple pest is fire blight, and it's caused by a bacterium, Erwinia, and it got its name because on pear trees, the infections cause the tissue just to turn black. On apple trees, the tissue turns this dead brown color. So what happens is the infections happen on open blossoms in spring. And the bacteria can be spread to the blossoms by wind-driven rain or by insects, and even bees going from flower to flower can spread that bacteria around. And so once the bacteria colonizes the flower, you get some rain, then an infection occurs and it kills that flower cluster. And then the bacteria continue to spread within the tree, killing the tissue along the way. So the bacteria can move out to new shoot growth, causing this shepherd's crook is what we call it, and then can continue on in the opposite way towards the main trunk of the tree. And once you get bacteria in the main stem or large scaffold limbs, it's much, much more difficult to manage. So with fire blight, the key for backyard trees is pruning out any infections. So one time to prune is in the winter, and the infections can be seen where the leaves are still attached to the twig. So when you see something like that, that's probably an old fire blight infection, and you'd want to prune that part out. And then another good option for the backyard is the application of copper. And this is something, again, you can get at any garden center, and that's applied to the tree, and it kind of reduces the spread of the bacteria during that bloom time. And if you have a tree that's had fire blight before, you haven't been able to really get it under control, then you could consider an antibiotic, and it's called streptomycin. And it's quite effective, but it's only used on open blossoms when we've had a prolonged period of warm, wet weather. The last thing is summertime pruning. So finding the infected areas of the tree. So in this video, this area right here is a dead part of the tree from fire blight. And so the area to prune is about 12, even 14 inches beyond what you see as dead tissue or visible symptomatic tissue. Okay, a peach pest is called greater peachtree borer. It looks like a wasp shown here, but it's actually a moth. And the females lay eggs right down at the soil line on the trunk. And the larvae feed at the base of the tree, spend the winter, and then in the spring start feeding again, and people will see a proliferation of gumming from the base of the tree. So younger trees that are attacked can be killed. But older trees, such as these that have been attacked, they can survive and heal over the feeding wounds. So here on this tree, you can see the larvae. There's a couple here at the base of this tree. And this is not a good situation because this tree is being grown in amongst lots of turf. So not only is there the competition for water and nutrients between the tree roots and the turf roots, but the turf up against the trunk of the tree is a good environment for the moths to come lay their eggs. They like that kind of protected area. So for management or prevention of peachtree borer is to know that trees can be attacked when up until maybe age 5 or a little older, when the bark becomes thickened. But removing the weeds around from the base of the tree is important. And then I would say probably the easiest thing to do is just a quick spray of an insecticide at the base of the tree. And I'm talking like 10 inches up from the ground, and a little bit around the ground area, which would take, 20 seconds to do one tree. So it will be done once a month, starting now, with your last application in mid-September. And the best option to use is called permethrin. And there's a few brands that contain permethrin, like the brand High Yield. Okay, so the final fruit pest is the Western cherry fruit fly. And if you guys are growing sweet cherries, then hopefully you are familiar with this pest and have actually started to spray your fruit. So the female, she lays her eggs under the skin of the fruit, which makes this more difficult to manage because the eggs are not exposed. And the larvae are not exposed. It's just the adult. And she can only lay her eggs in the fruit when they have turned, when the skin has become softer. So when the fruits are all green, the females, even though they may be out, the flies may be active, they're not able to penetrate the skin of the cherry. So it's not until this timing, when what we call like a salmon blush color that develops on the fruit skin. And that coloration, you'd want to look for it in the sunniest part of the tree, maybe the high, which means might be the fruit in the highest part of the tree. And even if the rest of the fruit is green, as soon as you have a few that are turning the salmon blush color, then you would want to start your management practices. So if you decide to use insecticides, then you know that you're going to be targeting the adults. So as I mentioned, the timing would begin at that yellow-pink stage. And the products I mentioned earlier in this webinar for codling moth would be the same as for cherry fruit fly. So you could use that same list. But if you are interested in non-chemical options, there are a few that may help reduce the infestation a little bit. So the larvae that are in the cherries, when they're mature, they'll drop from the cherry into the soil to pupate. And so if you put a tarp under the tree, starting when the fruit develops that salmon blush color up through harvest, the larvae that are feeding and dropping out will land on the tarp and not be able to get into the soil. And so if you periodically shake out that tarp into a trash can and do this over a few years, then you're going to hopefully reduce your population of the flies. But also, like with the apples, remove the dropped fruit because the maggots may still be in them. And when you're done harvesting and you still have fruit on the tree, just understand that that fruit can still become infested through October. So if at all possible, remove all the unharvested fruit from the tree, or you might want to do like one final spray just to help, even though you're not going to eat that fruit, it will still help reduce the population. And I have seen some folks buy huge widths and lengths of netting and just net their entire tree. And just important to know that it would have to be cinched off at the trunk of the tree, because if not, again, the flies are going to be coming up from the soil right into that netting. Okay, so a few landscape pests. The ones I wanted to talk about are scales, spider mites, and wood-boring insects. All right, so scales, I wanted to cover them because a lot of them are at a time right now where they need to be treated if they're in your landscape. So there's two different major groups of scales. One is called a soft scale. And if you're not familiar with scales, they are an insect, but they're immobile for most of their lives. And they feed by sucking out sap or plant cell contents. So soft scales have a rounded body that's attached for protection, whereas armored scales, they also have a rounded body, but the armor, which is made up of their shed skins, is detachable. But the armored scales are much more difficult to manage. So the soft scales, they overwinter as a mix of these young scales called nymphs and then the mature adult scales. And these larger ones here are the females and have 200 or so eggs inside their bodies. And the eggs hatch and they're called crawlers. So the young crawlers will move from where they hatched onto foliage. So this is the crawler right here. And this is an underside of a leaf here. And this is the leaf vein. And all of these are young scale crawlers. So they move to the leaves to feed for the summer and then move back to the twigs for the rest of their lives. But the thing with soft scales is they're like aphids. They feed on sap, and so they'll produce a lot of honeydew. But they don't, in even high populations, they will rarely kill trees. They'll cause some dieback, but again, they'll also be messy with the honeydew dripping down. And so on the flip side, armored scales, they do not produce honeydew. They feed on individual cells, so they're not feeding on the sap. And so here's some examples of some armored scales that people are dealing with in Utah. On pine trees, there's the black pine leaf scale. On sycamore, there's the sycamore scale. And then on a whole host of crops, and this crop or this plant here is a willow. This scale is called oyster shell scale. And then another fruit pest actually is San Jose scale, that if you've ever had an apple that has what looks like a little pimple on it with a red halo around it, then that's likely this scale, San Jose scale. And it can cover entire twigs, branches, the trunk, and as a result, it infests the fruit as well. So the armored scales can kill trees because their populations can build up so high. They have that armored covering, and so they're much more protected from predators, from temperature extremes. So, and they're feeding on plant cell contents. So they can kill trees. So for overall scale management, there's the dormant oil application. And what that is just the horticultural oil. It's mixed to a 2% concentration, and it's applied when the buds of trees just start to swell. So the dormant oil is pretty effective on the soft scales, but if you're trying to target some of those armored scales I mentioned, it's not going to kill all of them. A lot will survive. Another option is a systemic insecticide that's applied to the soil. And you really have to be careful in whether you decide this route, because you do not want to use this on trees that are bee pollinated. Those that are not, it would be fine to use it as a systemic insecticide. And then I mentioned there's the crawlers that hatch in spring. And so they are best, they are most susceptible to an insecticide. And so if you could contact me when are crawlers active for a particular pest, and I can let you know, then you could use or hire someone to use something more safe like oil, insecticidal soap, or a real targeted insecticide. Okay, spider mites. So this is a pest that will be active. It's active now, but will be much more apparent with this heat that we're having. So we have several different species of spider mites in Utah. They're all teeny tiny with 8 legs. And they're, as I mentioned, teeny tiny. So if you are familiar with the size of an aphid, then here you can see the comparison of a spider mite versus an aphid. So you definitely need a magnifying lens to see them. And as they feed, they're taking out chlorophyll. And so they're leaving behind flecks of white because there's no chlorophyll. And we call that stippling damage. So huge host range for these spider mites, but the stippling damage is pretty characteristic. And if you found that, you'd want to look at the underside of a leaf for those teeny tiny moving spider mites. You could also look for this webbing, which would occur under high populations. So for spider mites, look for them if you suspect them by shaking and shake a branch over a piece of paper and look to see if you see any of the flecks that fall move around, or you could smear it or slide your finger on it. And if it smears, then that would indicate a spider mite. And also look for spider mites in the lowest part of the shrub or tree on the interior leaves first. So in terms of management, spider mites thrive in hot, dry, droughty conditions. So again, this summer is going to be a big season for spider mites, but also in dusty conditions, because the dusty conditions kind of inhibit the movement of predatory mites, which would normally keep the spider mite populations in check. But if you needed to treat for spider mites, there's that go-to horticultural oil. There's a lot of different brands. Like if you were to go to your local garden center, there may be one called All Seasons Oil, and that would be a great one to use season long. And you're going to mix it at a 1% rate, not at that 2% rate that I mentioned for the dormant spray. But if it needs to be treated with something stronger and you hire a professional, make sure they're using a miticide, not an insecticide, because a lot of the insecticides don't necessarily work very well for mites. So I'm just going to take 1 or 2 more minutes and finish up with the last group of pests, the wood-boring insects. I will comment again with the topic of drought that the wood-boring pests really target the trees that are under stress already. So some groupings are clearwing moths, some general borers like flat-headed, round-headed, and bark beetles. And they pretty much have similar life cycles, where the larva spends the winter in the tree and the adults emerge in spring to early summer, Females lay their eggs on the bark, and larvae feed the rest of the summer and through the winter. So an example of that first group, the clearwing moths, is the lilac-ash borer. And if you have a lot of ash in your backyard, or you've seen ash street trees that look like this, it's the lilac-ash borer, which is a very common pest. In the adults, it's like that greater peachtree borer I mentioned. The adult looks like a wasp, and the larva feeds within the tree. So it basically weakens the tree, but doesn't kill it. The exit holes from the lilac-ash borer are fairly large and perfectly round. So another group of borers, and again, these are insects that are attacking trees that are already under stress, are flat-headed borers. So we have two species, Pacific flat-headed and flat-headed apple tree borer, that have a very wide host range. They fairly large, beetle, nondescript, and their exit hole is this large oval shape. If you grow birch tree, we have another flat-headed borer that's specific to birch called the bronze birch borer. And they're called the flat-headed borers because the larvae literally has a flat head, and they're feeding right under the bark in these meandering galleries that over time will essentially girdle that tree. So these can kill trees, but again, it's the drought stress and other things that are contributing to the death of the trees. And then just finally, bark beetles as part of the wood boring pests. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the beetles that have killed millions of acres of pines and spruces in the West. So one example is the mountain pine bark beetle. It's a super tiny insect, but it releases these pheromones that bring in other beetles. So they're attacking a single tree by the hundreds. And trees that are attacked will have these pitch tubes indicating their presence. One of the beetles that might be seen in backyard trees in Utah is the Ips, also known as the engraver beetle. And we might see that on spruce trees. So typically it's going to be attacking the tree from the top down. Spruce trees or conifers that are overall not looking so healthy. A lot of times it's something else that's going on. But with the engraver beetle, you would want to look for these teeny tiny exit holes, perfectly round, and the pitch tubes, and maybe some sawdust as well to indicate the beetle presence. So management of borers and bark beetle, the real key is prevention. So if you're going to prioritize your watering, don't worry about the lawn. As David said earlier, prioritize those specimen trees in your yard for watering over the lawn. So keep the trees healthy. If there's any infested trees, get those removed. There are trunk insecticides that can be used as a trunk spray that would take care of egg hatch. But really it's best to have a professional do that if you have some of these larger trees. And it's ideal to time the spray with the flight period. So that was just a super quick overview of a couple of fruit and landscape pests. So I am going to stop it there. Maybe we could look at a few questions while Nick gets his slides up. Let me just see if there's some.
Yeah, I think you can see them, Marion.
Yes.
So if you just want to read the question and answer, I left these because I think they're kind of relevant and good for everybody to hear those answers.
Yeah. So you think it'd be best to answer them live? Is that what you're saying, David?
Yeah. If you don't mind, it'll just take a few minutes. I think there's just five questions there. You can just read the question and answer it.
Yeah. So Kathy asks, I'm not familiar with the insecticides I talked about. So if one were to spray like a fruit tree, does it end up in the fruit? And the answer to the question is no, because most of these materials that are sold for backyards application are not systemic. They're just covering the surface of the leaves. A next question from Lucy: will pests damage a new catalpa tree? Trees were planted about 9 months ago, and catalpas can get aphids, and that's not something that's going to really harm the health of your tree too badly. So I would say look for aphids on the underside of the leaves. And other than that, I can't think of any other major pests. And then the pest for codling moth, I would say I'm going to provide the slides to David, and at the end, he'll talk about where they are going to be uploaded. And so maybe tomorrow you can go back and check on those materials. Okay, Bryce, let's see. Okay, so Bryce says, my brother-in-law said that the top of the tree belongs to the birds because it's hard to even harvest the fruit up there. Now, is that a bad practice? And are the chemicals harmful to the birds, bees, and other good insects? So number one, if you're not able to treat the cherry trees at the top of the tree, there's still going to be a buildup of the cherry fruit fly. So in the ideal world, you'd be managing the fruit on the entire tree. So that would be the best practice. Birds are certainly going to get fruits from throughout the entire tree. So the chemical treatments, most of them, again, that are available for the backyard applicator are safe for the birds because they are really targeting insects. They use the chemicals are targeting certain nerve elements or other modes of action within insects themselves. But you wouldn't want to apply them, say, if you're worried about bees, during the day. So wait until the evening or early morning when fewer bees are active. And then the final question: can Dawn soap be used as an insecticide? So I will say, Val, that certainly you have the option to do that, but I don't recommend it because you do have the potential of maybe putting in too much soap in your mixture and causing damage to the foliage. So really all I can recommend is to use a product that's called insecticidal soap that has an approved label for insects. But if you want to take that route, there's lots of info on the internet about that. Okay, so we'll let Nick take over.
Awesome. So again, my name is Nick Valesky. I work for our integrated pest management program. So I'm going to go over some common vegetable pests that you guys might be seeing in your gardens right now.
Nick, can I just comment that we are seeing your notes view?
Okay.
So I don't think you wanted it like that.
What about now?
Still.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Okay, now it's good.
Is it good now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so the first pest we're going to talk about is aphids, which you guys are probably familiar with. So aphids, they can be winged or wingless and they have these pear-shaped soft bodies. So both the adults and the nymphs feed on hosts with their piercing, sucking mouth parts, which can cause stippling, chlorosis, curl leaves, and or slow down the plant growth. And the 4 common species that we see on our vegetable crops here in Utah are the green peach aphid, potato aphid, melon aphid, and then the cabbage aphid. So the green peach aphid, those overwinter as eggs on the base or the buds of peach or nectarine trees. So they have that woody host during the winter. The melon aphid will overwinter on also woody hosts or various weeds. And then the same thing with the potato aphid, which will overwinter on plants in the rose family. And then the cabbage aphid's unique as it'll overwinter on whole crop debris that's laying around. So throughout the entire growing season, aphids are asexual. So they just clone or clone themselves and reproduce that way. And then in the fall, they'll become male and female to initiate that egg laying and then overwintering stage. So when we're monitoring for aphids, you want to thoroughly scout the crops and the weeds in your garden and look for signs or symptoms of aphids. So a lot of growers will use yellow sticky traps in their garden or like in a greenhouse setting. And you might be able to see some of the winged aphids land on that sticky trap. And then someone was asking about ants in the chat. And usually when you see ants on your plant, that could be a sign that there's aphids, because like you can see in this photo, the ants like to feed on the honeydew, which is the excretion of the aphids. Also look for casted white aphid skins. So when aphids develop through their nymph stages or instars, they'll cast their old skin. So those usually stick around on the foliage. Sometimes growers might confuse them for white flies. And then just be sure to always check the new budding growth of your plants. So here was on a shrub I saw where there was a bunch of new aphids right at the tip where the new growth is. And then on this kale plant, right at the base where the new leaves are starting to shoot out, you can see a colony of cabbage aphids. So when we manage aphids, you want to avoid excessive fertilization because aphid populations or aphid densities tend to be higher on plants that have an excess of nitrogen fertility. Some growers or gardeners might use mulches or row covers because the row covers can physically exclude the winged aphids from flying in and establishing on the plants. There's also been literature saying that metallicized or reflective mulches can repel the winged aphids or deter them from coming towards those plants. And then you don't want to plant your vegetable crops near overwintering hosts. So if you remember, we talked about those woody winter hosts where the aphids will lay their eggs. If you have vegetable crops near there, they can just fly right there in the spring and have access to that new host. And then of course, at the end of the season, you want to remove and destroy any plant debris because that can just help with sanitation. And you'll see that as a theme throughout this talk, that sanitation is super important for pest control. And then finally, there's a lot of natural enemies out there that you can encourage in your garden to feed on the aphids. So the common go-to example is the ladybug. There's also the lacewing adult and larva. And then there's some parasitic wasp that'll parasitize aphids as well. And a lot of growers like to use the insecticidal soaps that we just talked about or different neem oils because aphids have those soft body types. So when the oils get on the aphid, that just allows them to suffocate, or it causes them to suffocate, which eventually kills them off. Okay, so the next pest are slugs and snails. So these can be a problem on our vegetable crops or a lot of our ornamental crops, like someone was asking about hostas. So slugs and snails have similar characteristics, except snails have an external spiral shell. They both glide with a long muscular organ called the foot. And these pests are active at night or on dark, cloudy days. And then usually during the daytime, you won't see them because they're seeking relief from the sun and the heat in the shade underneath plants, rocks, wood, or compost piles. And they need moisture to thrive, but they can survive in relatively dry conditions by hiding in those protected areas. And these creatures, they're obviously not insects, they're mollusks, and they're also hermaphrodites, so meaning that there's not male or female slugs or snails, but they're all capable of reproducing. And they can lay multiple clusters of eggs throughout the growing season. And like I just said, slugs and snails feed on a wide variety of living plants, and fungi and decaying plant material. And they can be particularly damaging to new seedlings and maturing vegetables or fruits that touch the soil. So when we manage slugs and snails, the best thing we can do is remove damp or dark hiding places. And you don't want to over irrigate your crops because they like that moisture. So if we're doing a good job in conserving our water this season, we shouldn't see too many slugs or snails. Sometimes growers might use copper barriers because slugs and snails can receive an electric shock when they try to crawl over the copper. So in this picture, you can see it's used on a raised bed, or over here where they have kind of these collars around their lettuces. Diatomaceous earth is basically, it's just crushed up fossilized shells, and it's kind of a deterrent because it's really sharp, so it makes it difficult for the slugs and snails to cross over. However, if it gets kind of wet, then it'll be less effective. And then probably the most common method to manage slugs and snails is these homemade traps. Basically, it can be like a container of some sort that you place in the ground with different baits, usually like an iron phosphate or metaldehyde. Or some producers might use a beer, yeast, or honey mixture in the bait, and that'll attract the slugs and snails, and then they'll get caught in them. And of course, there's lots of natural predators like snakes, toads, frogs, birds, and ducks that'll feed on our slugs and snails. So next, I want to talk about leaf miners. So leaf miner commonly describes the larval stage of various insects, but those that feed on vegetable crops are most commonly these yellow and black flies in the order Diptera. So here's a picture of an adult spinach leaf miner. But other common species we've seen are the American serpentine leaf miner, pea leaf miner, and vegetable leaf miner. So again, the adults are these flies, and they'll lay these tiny little white eggs on, usually we see them on spinach, chard, or beet greens, but they can attack any vegetable crop. And then once those eggs hatch, we get the larva, or we call it a maggot because it's the fly immature stage. And they'll start mining in between the two leaf layers, the two mesophyll layers. So I showed in these pictures kind of the 3 stages of damage. So early on, you might see kind of subtle damage like this. Then as the larva gets bigger and continues to feed, it can become really severe. So this piece of chard right here on the right would not be considered marketable. So to manage leaf miners, first you just want to inspect your leaves. So look for these little white egg masses throughout the growing season, and then you can just crush them. Because remember, those are the eggs. And then you can clip and remove the infested leaves. So that will get rid of the larva, and you wouldn't be selling those leaves anyway. And then some growers might gently just cultivate the soil in case there's that pupa that's overwintering, or not overwintering, or just during the summer, if it's just pupating for the next generation, that can disrupt it. And then there's some parasitic wasp species that you can encourage by just planting, or I guess for any beneficial, you can just plant flowering plants that with nectar and pollen rich type flowers. And then obviously row covers, because remember, row covers are physically excluding the adult fly from accessing the plant. So this is probably the most common method used by our larger farms. So related to the leaf miners, we have root maggots. So these are also flies, but instead of mining the leaves, they affect our newly germinated seeds and the roots of different plants. So maggots prefer feeding in soils rich in organic and decaying matter, such as manure. Seed corn maggots feeding can destroy the seed germinating and may cause the plant tissue to rot. Larvae burrow into the seeds, leaving the plant with insufficient resources to sprout and or survive. So these maggots, they can also attack underground stems and roots of sprouted corn is a common one that can just cause it to become weaker. So 3 examples that we sometimes see here in Utah are the seed corn maggot, cabbage maggot, and then onion maggot. So again, the fly is the adult stage. They'll lay their eggs, and then the maggot or the larva is the damaging stage. And then once that reaches maturity, it will pupate into the soil. So when we manage root maggots, we want to plant seeds. Well, sometimes if you're using raised beds, that can promote the soil to warm and dry quickly, which isn't desirable for root maggots. So usually we don't see them in raised bed gardening. That's usually more in a field setting or in the ground. In the fall, you can destroy or disc underneath the crop residue, because again, that'll disrupt that overwintering life stage. And then you can rotate susceptible crops with unrelated crops. So crop rotation is another theme that we see in pest management that's really effective when you're taking away that host crop every other year. Okay, so there's several different beetles that can attack our vegetables. They're all in the order Coleoptera. And some examples that I included are there's various species of flea beetles, which are the smallest ones. Sometimes we'll see cucumbers. Those are the yellow ones that can be spotted or striped. The Colorado potato beetle. And then we're seeing a lot more of these ones, the three-lined potato beetle. And this is really common on tomatillo plants. And then the cereal leaf beetle, which usually affects a lot of small grains, but we can see it on our sweet corn as well. And then some that I've seen a lot this spring are, this is another type of leaf beetle in the Monoxia family, or sorry, the genus Monoxia. So when we talk about beetles, they all kind of have the same feeding damage. So the adults, they'll usually emerge in the springtime from their overwintering stage, and they can begin feeding right away. And sometimes the larva stage of the beetles can cause damage. So like in these top photos, I have the three-lined potato beetle larva and the Colorado potato beetle larva, where just like the adults, they'll feed on the foliage, causing a lot of extensive damage. In this image, I have a picture of a cucumber beetle larva feeding into the kind of the crown and root of the plant. And then the adults can do a lot of feeding damage as well. So like this was a squash blossom, and then you can see the leaves where it's just almost completely skeletonized it. And then they can also, the cucumber beetle will also feed on the rinds of different cucurbit crops. So here's a cucumber with some feeding damage. And then the flea beetles, which is probably the most common one that we see in our vegetables, they're really small, but they can cause these tiny little holes in the foliage, and we call that pitting. And then some species of flea beetles, their larvae can cause damage too. So here's a potato tuber where you can see the different larval feeding. So when we manage beetles, some simple things we can do is rotate our crops with non-host crops, like I said before. We can keep the crop area weed free, because oftentimes weeds can serve as an alternate host. So if we have a lot of weeds nearby, that's going to give them somewhere to harbor and shelter. And then sometimes growers might consider the row covers again. But you have to be careful about which crops you're using the row covers on, so you're not interfering with the timing of pollination. And then some of our commercial growers so in Emory County, where there's a lot of melon farms, they use these lure traps. So this is obviously like a milk jug or orange juice jug, where they have the holes, and then they place the cucumber beetle lures in there, and then that'll attract the cucumber beetles away from the plants into this big trap. And then, of course, in the fall, tilling can help disrupt that overwintering pupa stage. Okay, so now we're going to talk about caterpillar pests. So just like the beetles, there's several different caterpillars that can attack our vegetable crops. So I listed a bunch of photos here. There's cabbage looper, diamondback moth larva, imported cabbage worm larva, the corn earworm, alfalfa looper, several different cutworm species, and then several different armyworm species, and then of course the tomato and tobacco hornworms. So again, caterpillars are the larval stages of different moth or butterfly species. So the adult will lay their eggs, and then the larva will hatch, develop through several different instars, and then it'll pupate and then repeat the cycle. And all caterpillars have these chewing mouth parts, and they can cause damage to the foliage, the stems, the fruits, and sometimes even the roots of our crops. So when we manage caterpillars, I think the best thing to do is just conduct regular scouting for the larvae and look for damage. If you're working in a small garden, you can just simply hand remove them as you find them. In larger fields, some of our vegetable farmers will use different types of pheromone traps. So here's an example of one where they hang the lure in here, and then the moths will fly in and then get trapped. And then, like I said before, tilling or just lightly disking the soil at the end of the season can disrupt that overwintering stage. Crop rotation, and then of course you can encourage natural enemies. So here's one where a parasitic wasp has infected a hornworm caterpillar. And then here's a lacewing larva eating a caterpillar. And then of course there's several other beneficial insects out there. And then if you have a really serious problem, you could consider spraying insecticides. And some effective ones have active ingredients like carbaryl, cyfluthrin, permethrin, zeta-cypermethrin, spinosad, which is an organic one, and then Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a biological one, that's BT. So those all work great on caterpillar species. Okay. So I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to kind of rush through, or not rush, but kind of speed through the rest of these. So squash bugs, you guys are all familiar with. These are not beetles. These are true bugs. They're in the Hemiptera family. And their eggs are those tiny little brown, bronze-colored ones laid in clusters. So when they hatch, they hatch as nymphs, and then they'll develop through different instars into the adult stage. And they have these long, straw-like, piercing, sucking mouth parts, and they'll suck out the xylem and phloem of our cucurbit plants. So that causes the wilting. So when you see this, that's likely an indicator that it's a squash bug. So when you're looking for them, look at the base of the plant, and then for the adults, and then look underneath the leaves for the eggs. And I put these pictures on the bottom because these are kind of look-alike squash bugs that a lot of people get confused. So we have some brown stink bugs, a kissing bug, and then a western conifer seed bugs. So these are all in the same order, but they're not in the same family order as squash bugs. So do not get those confused when you're monitoring. So there's several ways to manage squash bugs. If you go to your local county office, they'll have these new squash bug management cards so you can get the full details. But in summary, sanitation, growing resistant varieties, rotating your crops, the timing of planting, just removing the eggs with duct tape or petroleum jelly, using trap crops. Those are all just a few examples of squash bug management. So earwigs are easy to identify, right? They have those prominent pairs of pinchers, or cerci we call them, on the rear of their body. They're omnivorous, so they'll feed on plants and other insects, including and we'll see them damaging our vegetable crops. So it kind of looks like the beetle damage, but you can see some damage on the corn, and then some lettuce, and then the other foliage damage too. So they can be really problematic in that sense. But to manage them, we recommend placing boards or corrugated cardboard, rolled up or crumpled moistened newspaper. And in the mornings, or because they're active at night, so during the daytime, they'll congregate under there. So when you lift those up, then you can find them and destroy them. A lot of growers will use these in the ground traps, similar to like those slug traps we talked about earlier. You can fill them with smelly oil like bacon grease, clam oil, and then that'll just allow them to fall in there and get trapped as well. Okay, so thrips. We have the western flower thrips and the onion thrips, which are the two most common in Utah. And they can actually vector the tomato spotted wilt virus, which can affect a lot of our Solanaceae crops. So the adults, they're really tiny, they're minute, elongated with these yellow-brown bodies, and they have those kind of fringed wings or kind of hairy-looking wings. And so they feed with these kind of beak-like mouth parts with kind of a punch and suck behavior. So they can cause scarring damage on the leaves. So you can see here just kind of a close-up of what thrips feeding looks like. So to manage them, you can use yellow or blue sticky traps. You can plow underneath the debris at the end of harvest and remove volunteer plants. And when you're looking for them, you're going to need a hand lens just because they're so tiny. And a lot of home gardeners, what they'll do is they'll just overhead irrigate, or not irrigate, just like wash off the thrips with their foliage because the water will help dislodge them. And remove weeds, so keep the area weed free. We usually don't recommend insecticides just because thrips can develop a lot of resistance. And unless there's a virus that they're spreading, they tend not to be that serious of a problem. Okay, this is my last pest. So I want to talk about grasshoppers. So make sure I got time. Okay, I just need 2 more minutes, and then I should be good.
You got plenty of time, Nick. Go ahead and just take whatever you need.
Okay, so the 4 common grasshopper species that we see in our urban and rangeland settings include the differential grasshopper, the banded wing grasshopper, the migratory grasshopper, and then the red-legged grasshopper. And the problem with having all these species of grasshoppers is that some will hatch early in the season, which I'm sure you guys should be seeing now. There's a lot of grasshopper nymphs out, but others won't be hatching until later on in the season. So there's just this continuous cycle of grasshoppers that's going to be happening all year. In the fall, after grasshoppers mate, and the females, they'll lay their eggs in about 1 to 2 inches in the soil where the nymphs will hatch the following spring. So both adults and nymphs will feed with their chewy mouth parts, causing these random jagged holes in the foliage, which kind of looks like the earwig and beetle damage. And they can feed on the leaves, flowers, and sometimes the immature pods and fruit. So I think probably if you just have a few plants or a small garden setting, I think insect netting, placing that over your plants would be the most effective because you're physically excluding those grasshoppers from getting to your plants. You can encourage natural enemies like birds, reptiles in your garden that'll feed on the grasshoppers. And one popular product that you'll hear people talk about is Nolo bait, which is, I think it's just the one company that manufactures and sells it, but it's a microprotozoa, Nosema locustae, which we call Nolo for short. And how it works is it's a bait. So when the grasshoppers eat it, it'll kill about 50 to 70% of the population. And then the remaining surviving grasshoppers will be infected. And then those infected grasshoppers are obviously weakened. They'll feed less and they'll produce fewer eggs. And I watched some videos where they made these PVC bait traps where they actually place the bait inside the tubes, and that'll protect it from getting wet or blown away. And then they'll place these throughout their property, and then that's how the grasshoppers eat it. And then I have kind of a bird's eye view of a neighborhood, just to kind of make the point that controlling grasshoppers is a community-wide effort. So if you live on this property in the red square and you're the only one actively controlling grasshoppers, but the rest of your neighborhood isn't, not much is going to happen because grasshoppers are highly mobile. So they can just leave an area and then they can come back. So we always promote community-wide control for grasshoppers. Okay, so I just kind of blew through all of those, and there's obviously lots more vegetable pests out there. If you guys want to learn about them, you can visit our website, which is extension.usu.edu/pest. And there's a ton of stuff on this website. So any question you might have, you can find the answer here. We have the link to our Utah Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab. So if you ever have an insect image you want to send, you can email that to us. Or if you have a diseased plant sample, you can submit that to our lab and we can identify that for you and come up with a management plan. We have educational how-to videos on several different vegetable, ornamental, and fruit pests. And if you go to our free guidebooks and ebooks, we have one on turf, ornamental, tree pests, vegetable, and fruit pests. So those are great comprehensive resources to check out. And then, of course, we have fact sheets, which are really handy on every pest you can think of. We have information on it. So that'll go over its biology, life cycle, how you can monitor for it, and how you can manage it. And then you can find some recorded webinar presentations like this one. And then, of course, we have our Utah Pest Advisories. So you can find these archived on pestadvisories.usu.edu. And these are timely email alerts on insects and diseases to look out for. So these get sent to you, and when you get them, it'll just list certain pests that you need to be aware of. So we have these for fruit, vegetables, turf, and landscape. So again, this was a lot of information I kind of rushed through, but feel free to contact myself if you have any more specific questions. And
Nick, yeah, thank you. There's a couple of questions just in the Q&A box, if you wouldn't mind addressing those just verbally for everybody. And then let me mention to Tess, one of our attendees, you've raised your hand. If you will please just type your question into the Q&A box, then we can address that there as well. Thank you.
So Wendy asked, do root maggots affect growing bean plants? So yeah, so the seed corn maggot I talked about, that one will specifically probably affect the bean plants, especially when it's just germinating. So Bryce asked, we have a small garden about 12 by 50 meters. We've had squash bugs several times over the past 20 years. We were told the only way to handle them is to not plant squash, pumpkin, etc. for at least 3 years anywhere in the garden. Is that accurate? Yeah, so I think that kind of goes into the theme of crop rotation, which I get in a small garden setting. That's not going to be super effective because your plants are still going to be relatively close. Bryce, if you go to your county office and get this card, you can find some more strategies. But something that I did with my cucurbits this year is I didn't plant them until June because the peak egg laying and adult emergence is usually in May. So I feel like by waiting for June, I haven't seen a lot of squash bugs on my plants yet, while other growers who have a lot larger plants are seeing them. So maybe consider planting later in the season and see if you have any luck that way.
Maybe Nick, if there, well, we'll just ask anybody else. If there's any other questions for Nick or Marion, if you'll just type them into that Q&A box. And then maybe there's a question I've been asked several times about like the powder 7 for cucumbers and melons for squash bugs. Do you want to address that? And then maybe you've already talked about it with the active ingredient, and I just don't know what that active ingredient is.
Yeah, so the active ingredient for the powder, it's permethrin, which I think the one brand that I found was Benide 8 Garden Dust. And I listed them on the card, and you just want to make sure that it's labeled for squash bugs. And I think they're challenging to control too, just because their structure. So they kind of have that hard back. So it's best to manage them at the nymph stage when they're smaller and more vulnerable. And I think since squash bugs, they like the base of the plant, they like to hide underneath stuff, that can make sprays challenging as well. So we like to focus on those cultural and mechanical control methods for squash bugs.
That's great. Thank you. I'm I'm not sure if we're going to have any other questions. Sometimes we wait just, another minute, give people time to type if they're going to type. But this has been very informative. And again, for the attendees that are still on here, we will get the slides as a PDF. We'll post them on our website tomorrow. After this, I just close up. I'm done with work after this, right? So it'll be tomorrow. And if you can't find them, you're sure welcome to email Hattie Ann or myself or call our office. We can kind of help you through our website to find them. And then you can either review the video recording, you can look at the slides, and then if we'll steer you maybe to some questions. As Nick mentioned, the websites, the pest advisory websites, if you want to get emails and stay up to date on current things that are happening when they're happening, please sign up for those USU pest advisories, because then you'll get an email that's kind of describing and helping you with what's currently happening, the pests that are active, how to manage those pests, and certainly jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on these, both of you. But that's a great resource for people. We're trying to steer people there all the time. You don't have to guess. You don't have to go buying chemicals that you don't understand. Get that pest advisory, and then there's both organic and chemical means, whatever you're comfortable with, of how to manage things when it's the proper time to manage them. So we constantly encourage that. Looks like there are a few questions. Let's see, maybe they're not questions.
I see one question about, I'll take the one about the grape leaves from Patty. My grape leaves are curling, but I don't see or feel any bugs. So one option or possibility could be herbicide damage, which grapes are very sensitive to. And it could be nothing that you sprayed. It could have been a neighbor a few houses down. With the hot weather, if an herbicide is used, sometimes it can volatilize and those gas vapors can spread and affect the foliage. So I would say especially if it's the newer foliage, just curled and distorted, that might be herbicide damage. But Patty, I'd suggest you send myself some pictures so we can get a better idea of really what might be going on.
Do either one of you want to talk about the effectively testing moisture in soil and alkalinity items?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do the easiest way to test the soil moisture is go and get one of those soil testing. I don't know the name of it, but it's a T. You can get it at IFA, and it takes a core of soil. You punch it down, pull it back up, and if the soil in your hand, if you can squeeze it, it maintains the shape. There's plenty of moisture. So that's like the easiest way. Otherwise, there are soil moisture sensors that you can put in your farm, and you can go around to each sensor and get the measurement. And as far as alkalinity, I might recommend you take a soil sample and get it tested by the Utah State University Analytical Lab. So it's USU Analytical Lab is what you would Google, and they could do a soil test for you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you can usually pick up one of those kits from your county extension office, and they'll give you directions on how to sample. Then you can get that sample into that little kit and send it to the lab, and then they'll send you back a very comprehensive report on alkalinity, on the macro and micronutrients, and all the stuff, different recommendations for improving soil, organics or structure, whatever it is. It's a great resource. It does cost, but you could check out your county extension office for information on that as well.
Yeah, I want to say it's about anywhere from $20 to $30.
Yeah.
The home soil testing kits. What do you think about those, David?
I don't have any experience with those, honestly. I don't know.
Okay.
I've heard some people say, oh yeah, I think they're accurate, but I don't know. I really don't.
Yeah, if it were me, I would use the USU Analytical Lab, because they're just going to give you so much more information.